I want to introduce the first speaker of the day, Joanne Bowen. Dr. Bowen will talk about an anthropologist's observations on the human family and its connections to the environment. Dr. Joanne Bowen retired in December 2016 from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, where she has served since 1983 as the curator of zooarchaeology and environmental collections. She continues as research professor in anthropology at the College of William and Mary. She is also the family representative, archivist, founder, and first president of the Murray Bowen Archives Project. Please go to that website and see the progress that she has chaired in developing the archives, the paper material, electronic materials produced by Dr. Murray Bowen that are now available at the National Library of Medicine. Dr. Bowen, Joanne, has discussed her work in various Bowen Theory conferences. She was involved in developing the conference at the Bowen Center, Societies, Families, and Planet Earth, Exploring the Connections. She has participated in Wisdom of the Ages 4 here in Houston and spoke at the first International Bowen Theory meeting in Western Pennsylvania Family Center in Pittsburgh. So welcome, Dr. Bowen, again. I look forward to your thinking today.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. And this has been a topic of great interest of mine for many, many years. And so here we go. And so globalization has brought about an increasingly interdependent world where the Western world has come to depend upon staples produced in the Third World, and people in these developing economies have come to depend upon grains and processed foods produced in the United States. So today I'm going to describe what is happening to families and their ability to relate to one another, how modernization has altered the economic and social fabric of these societies, and show how family-based forms of cooperation are fading in the face of modern impersonal forms of labor. And I'll describe how non-industrial societies are organized around kin, that even the economy is structured around and functions through the family. So when societies begin to produce commodities for sale, the very basis of their economic system is altered. In these situations, economic systems become increasingly impersonal. The labor to produce and distribute it within groups moves from personal, family-based exchange to impersonal, cash-based economic relationships. There are both benefits and unintended consequences. Many, including women, are educated and jobs are created. The Green Revolution has increased output, and companies have begun producing foods for the Western market. Cultural values change in the face of Western values. Family becomes less important, and for the poorest, poor diet and health problems. Anthropology provides a useful perspective for understanding these changes, how it is that Latin Americans are coming across the Mexican border, seeking better opportunities for their families, who are often left behind. So first I want to give you just a little bit of a background. I'm an anthropologist specializing in historic zooarchaeology of colonial America, and my work has focused on historic ethnography, agricultural economics, human-animal relationships, and landscape ecology. My dissertation was on an agrarian community in New England, and to understand what I was seeing, I read ethnographies of contemporary societies. In the background is my upbringing with Murray Bowen, who always had an eye and ear for relevant facts wherever he saw them. And I will present 3 case studies. And the first is the Kungsan, a hunting and gathering group who live in the Kalahari Desert. And today we are in the company of Dr. Connor, who has worked with this group and who can no doubt expand far beyond what I can do. and my sincere hope is that I do justice to these people whose rich lives can teach us all. The second is a rural farming village in the Andes. And third, an 18th century town, Suffield, Connecticut. Whoops, I'm missing my slides, so you have a little bit to catch up. I need to keep thinking about that. And third, an 18th century town, Suffield, Connecticut, that underwent these changes centuries ago when emerging cities and an international market providing opportunities that were much like the global economy today. And so, first, before I begin, I want to address how Murray Bowen's concept of societal emotional process is critically important. And if it's combined with similar studies, they have the potential to guide successful development programs. When Bowen began working on his eighth concept, he observed a heightened level of anxiety in families, communities, national government, the international community. He observed humans were increasingly moving into disharmony with their environment, and he looked for forces that had the potential to mobilize chronic anxiety on a societal level. He identified population explosions, rapid depletion of natural resources, and the disappearance of new land to colonize. He theorized the emotional response was related to the human species survival instinct, that it emerged out of threats to the relationship with the earth and its resources. When either real or perceived threats emerge, togetherness forces come into play, and people and institutions join to enhance their functioning at the expense of a third party. The power of his concept is that it addresses the effect anxiety has on lowering the overall level of differentiation in society, and it provides a way to encourage thoughtful, fact-based planning. His understanding came from his personal experience growing up on his family farm just outside Waverly, Tennessee. In his letters and in his stories, he described laboring alongside his parents and siblings on land that had sustained his family for generations. His father was a town leader who owned and ran a store in town, but also supervised work on the farm. To hear Bowen describe it, as kids, we worked our lives away to help Mother prepare the year's food from the fields, garden, orchards, kill animals, and more. A hired man butchered hogs, plowed the field with his mule, and did other odd jobs, and hired girls helped indoors. But family members planted, milked, stacked wood, made sausage and cider, and stored fruits and vegetables. His father's knowledge of the world, of the natural world, ran even deeper. According to Murray Bowen, he said he knew botany and what it was all about, and he could predict weather from moss on trees, the thickness of animal furs, and the density of fogs. He knew each and every sound from birds and animals. He determined his kids would know the land, and he put a tremendous amount of time with his sons hunting and fishing, inspecting crops, gathering nuts, explaining his built-in knowledge of nature. His experience led him to write about people who grew up in cities, particularly those who join groups such as the Sierra Club. They teach nature as a part-time lark, but the thing they knew and grew up with was a life of plenty in modern technological society. There is no way to convey the cycles of nature to people who grew up with bathrooms and electricity, away from life cycles of farm animals and the wild animals who lived in the nearby woods. Their knowledge is compartmentalized and not really a part of them. They do not know the life cycles I knew from having lived in it. He remarked in a letter that he was open and searching for ways to understand human behavior. He had gone into medicine, but found the field to be built on a foundation of sand, too separated from the animal world from which man himself sprang. He went on to suggest anthropology might possibly provide a way to view the human's connectedness to the animal world. He left to future scholars the task of developing a greater understanding of how these threats could generate intense anxiety. Anthropology is a broad field, including the study of past and current human groups, viewed variously through the lens of semiotics, belief systems, societal formations, human biology, and ecology. Gregory Bateson focused on the human's ability to communicate as the primary force shaping lives. Another is Claude Lévi-Strauss, who believed all cultural practices have homologous counterparts in other cultures, and thus, existing within all cultures, are deep structures that are essentially equatable. Both approaches set the human species apart from other life forms. Language and the ability to communicate through symbols and beliefs define behavior. Another theoretical school distinguishes between culture and society. Societies are groups of families that are organized in systematic, predictable ways that sustain life. This approach dates to the late 19th century when Emile Durkheim focused on how societies maintained internal stability and survived over time. Later, British anthropologists conceptualized societies as organized, interdependent parts, such as the family, the economic and political systems that collectively form the social structure. In this approach, society is viewed as groups of people interacting, bound together by social institution and rules that regulate and maintain the whole. Culture is another system, a value system that is learned by each generation and codified in its religion, myths, and legends. Another group are economic anthropologists, and they contribute very importantly to my understanding of the human connection with the earth. There are different approaches, but the one I found most compelling is that economy begins with labor, the need to produce and procure. And when I realized that no farmer, no forager, no family can do it all themselves, even with the help of their children. There are times when they're of harvest, a planting, hunting, gathering, plowing, where they all need extra labor. And they look to kin, neighbor, friends, hired labor. So it is this labor that connects the human family to the land. And they form human social systems. And so to understand the human connection to the world is to understand the social activity through which humans produce food. And for me, this is the key to see how the human connection to the earth is so very fundamental. Now, there is another group of anthropologists, known early on as cultural ecologists and more recently as human ecologists, are also systems thinkers. Their theoretical approach, which was developed by Julian Stewart, examines the dynamic interrelationships that exist between the earth and the life forms that inhabit it. Stewart and many since have shown that society has its own adaptive mechanisms, and families are closely bound in an ecological system where they are organized in a way that they, along with their extended kin and neighbors, procure a living from the land. As a teenager, Stewart left his home in Washington, D.C. to attend a newly established boarding school located in California near Death Valley. It was a ranch, and he, along with other students, were expected to construct buildings, herd, and be responsible for any and all chores. They learned if they failed to bring in the hay during the summer, cattle would go hungry in the winter. Stewart's experience proved notable. Nearby, the Paiute Indians continued to forage much like their ancestors had done. He was taken by how close these people were to the land, and years later, he returned to study the Shoshone. He saw how their primary resource, pinon nuts, defined the basic organization of their society, how families formed in small groups, but formed larger groups when pinons were abundant. Here in this desert environment, mobile and fluid family groups defined the basic structure of their society. This research formed the backbone of Stewart's theory. His model, which evolved out of the social sciences, views society as a natural system where families are organized around land and its resources. And he showed that one, households are closely bound in an ecological relationship. First, Social groups are defined by the availability of resources and the level of technology. Second, kin and neighbors form the workforce of the economy, and they do so by working together to procure a subsistence. Third, the size of human groups and their social, economic, and political organization are all related to how land is utilized. And lastly, when the use of land changes, so too does the political, social, and economic organization of the society. What I have come to understand is that this level of organization is what Bowen did not fully recognize. And understanding the social organization through which families connect to the earth is essential for any development plan to be successful. On many occasions, I reflected how Murray Bowen worked with the nuclear family as an emotional unit. His brilliance was that he was able to conceptualize how the nuclear family is an emotional unit. And through triangles, emotional cutoff, family projection, multi-generational transmission, sibling position, societal emotional process, the natural system extended to include kin, neighbor, friends, communities, local, national, and international institutions. Had Murray Bowen known about Stewart, I believe he would have appreciated his belief that the social systems form the foundation for human life. So, oops, I forgot another slide. Here he is in his office where he worked till 2, 3, 4, 6 in the morning, many of the days of his life. So I need to focus on my slides a bit more. Okay, I'm an archaeologist who benefited from learning the emotional process from my father and who benefited from my long career in anthropology. It has been past societies, New England and other European colonies. My two knowledge bases, Bowen and human ecology, have been essential in my constructing the past. All to say, I do not have specific recommendations for developers or those working with immigrant families. And my hope is that this presentation will guide others to consider the importance of the social relationships. To be cut off from each other and the land is enough to initiate anxiety on a societal level. In foraging societies where families hunt and gather wild plants, and in agrarian economies where farmers raise crops and husband livestock to feed their families, social and economic structures are grounded in solid principles of cooperation among kin groups. The connection to the land is deep, direct, and enduring. However, when another group takes over resources and the inhabitants lose control, or when the production of commodities becomes the goal, there is a cascade effect in the way families relate to the land and to each other. The result is a shift in the mode of production, and kin-based reciprocal exchange systems fade in the face of hired labor. The ripple effect is deep, and the laborer becomes disenfranchised from the land. Those with fewer resources and fewer kin connections are impacted the most. It is this group that works as field labor, or they move to towns, or even leave their home to look for work in towns, cities, or even migrate to countries in search of work. Let me begin with the Kung. For many thousands of years, hunters and gatherers who moved across the land to harvest plants and to hunt wild game. Gradually, in the face of expanding agricultural peoples, this way of life almost disappeared. In 1963, Richard Lee completed a study that stunned the professional community, who presumed foraging was a hard way to make a living. He showed that these people who lived in this arid environment, where there were only 6 to 9 inches of rainfall yearly, survived quite well working 2 to 3 days a week. A foraging way of life became known as the original affluent society. The environment is a vast sandy plain with valleys. Resources are scattered. There's scrub forest and open plains, and a short, unpredictable rainy season. Season when water collects in shallow pans and many foods are available. the dry season when surface water evaporates and foliage withers. There were 9 water holes in this area at this time, each with their own surrounding hinterlands. Families would cluster around these water holes. Their societal organization is distinctive. They are organized into small groups of closely related kin, 10 to 30 individuals. Why small? That the young less than 15 and those older than 60 could not contribute much to the food supplies. So the basic cluster were basically 2 dependents and 3 producers. So they were organized around a core related older people, their cousins or siblings, and they lived in camps near water holes spread throughout the region. But the composition was fluid, always changing as individuals moved in and out of different camps. For leadership, there was no former leader. Often it was the elder of the core group who had great hunting skills and who was a good leader. Land ownership. They did not own land like we did. The groups living together shared the rights over a territory. Each group would negotiate with other groups living nearby for the use of the resources. Visitors would ask permission for the use of water, gather, and to hunt. But the resident group would never deny permission. And how did they resolve tension in this society? They'd simply move to another camp. There's some great stories. The men would hunt, in former times, up to 80 species: warthog, porcupine, hare, antelope, many species of birds and fowl. And the nutrition when the game was abundant was upwards of 40% of the game contributed to the diet. Women would gather. They would collect around 30 species of wild fruits and berries, and one of the most important was the mongongo nut. Sometimes the women spent hours collecting, carrying them back to camp. Sometimes the camp would move temporarily for a short time to a grove while collecting. And the mobility was centered around these resources and their availability. Depending on the availability, the groups would group and regroup. They would congregate, or they would, they would congregate at the dependable water holes. When it was moderate, 11 groups would go to 5 holes. When the drought was severe, 11 groups would go to 2 holes. Every family society has the problem of providing food for every member. In foraging societies where people are constantly moving, they do not accumulate food resources in the sense that we agricultural people do. As they harvest, they share, yes, in the dictionary sense of the word, and you all know what Murray Bowen said about sharing, they would share amongst their group until there was nothing left to share. Hunters shared game with their partners, who split their meat with family members, who split what they received with others, until everyone in the camp had received a portion. Plants that were collected and prepared by women were normally shared only within the family circle, but visitors, even individuals passing by the fire, would be invited to eat. So these people are fully aware of the enormous social value of their food sharing practices. No one has the right to expect more than others. Richard Lee wrote about the values reinforcing this behavior, and he used a story that he has published in a pretty interesting article. At Christmas time, he wished to repay their kindness by buying a big fat ox and offering it as a feast to all. But his generosity was not well received. The king told him his ox was skinny, old, and worthless. An elder tried to help him and asked him, "Do you honestly think you can serve meat like that to people and avoid a fight?" "I don't mean a fight with you, white man, but a fight amongst my people. With such a small quantity of meat to distribute, how can you give everybody a fair share? Someone is sure to accuse another of taking too much or hogging all the choice pieces. Then you will see what happens when some go hungry while others eat." Lee tried to buy another cow to make sure he had enough for everyone, but no one would sell him one. When his ox was slaughtered, he saw how much feet and fat there was. Each family received about 50 pounds of fat and meat, and they feasted on it for 2 days. Why were they laughing at him? Several days he understood the lesson every hunter learns. Normally, hunters speak of their lack of skill and the smallness of their kill. To brag was to be arrogant, and arrogance leads to a young man thinking of himself as a chief or a big man, who thinks of others as his servants or inferiors. They told him, "We can't accept this. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody. So we speak of his meat as worthless to cool his heart and make him gentle." Lee had not understood giving one ox at Christmas did not wipe out a year of debts. No one benefited from bragging or taking power over the other. Sharing depended upon mutual obligation. All gave until there was none left to give. At first contact, outsiders did not alter their way of life. In the 1690s, the Dutch who had settled the Cape Good Hope began to hunt sporadically in the region. In the 1870s, the Tswana, a cattle herding group, began to hunt in the region. The Kung acted as trackers and meat carriers, a task they could incorporate into their hunting rounds. Sometime later, the Tswana began to graze their cattle in their territory during the summer. Eventually, they obtained rights over the entire valley, and by the turn of the 20th century, they had established permanent cattle posts. The Tswana owned their herds and offspring, but hired young Kung to take their cattle with them on their hunting rounds. During this time, the Kung remained foragers, moving seasonally in family groups, incorporating movements in and out of cattle posts as part of their rounds. So the Tswana and the Kung hunted side by side, and the Tswana women gathered wild plants alongside the Kung women. The 1960s was a time when the whites began to settle the region. And they brought change that ultimately affected the Kung in ways that restricted and eventually eliminated their ability to forage. So I've got a quick summary of the events that led the Kung to lose control over their territory, their ability to move freely, lose control over water and wildlife, and eventually become sedentary. In 1965, the government tried to expel blacks and their cattle by building a fence along the Namibia-Botswana border. This step did isolate cattle, but it also altered wildlife movements. The Kung were allowed to pass through it, but were impacted, but the free flow that they had once had was greatly diminished. In 1967, they established the first trading post, where the whites purchased cattle from blacks. This was the first step to inserting a cash economy into the region. They hired the Kung to herd cattle and run drives. The store sold staple foods, dry goods, and sugar, an opportunity for the Kung women who set up a thriving business of brewing beer. And the men began to seek work in the South African gold mines. And at this time, the government began providing the Kung with cattle and bags of seed to plant. Some began to build semi-permanent houses near cattle enclosures. The tribal grazing land policy took the land out of communal into freehold tenure, and in doing so altered the ancient foundation of open territory where the Kung could move freely. They passed game laws to protect endangered species. The Kung were no longer able to hunt. Instead, they herded cattle, worked as laborers, and depended on imported foods provided in government programs. By the 1970s, the economic relationships had changed towards the less personal forms that we know. They lost over 70% of their traditional hunting territory. They were forbidden to kill certain animals, and no one was living in the bush, and a large camp had built up around the cattle post. So Only a few men had jobs and were able to acquire food. Other relatives depended on those who work. So there was jealousy, anger, infected everyone, more alcohol, fights, tensions rose, and there was a situation of rowdy drinking and brawls. And post-2000, and this is where my information from what I was reading gets a little slimmer, but there was 25,000 square miles became a gang park, and the Kung were removed. And at this point, no one lived by hunting and gathering, and they had a diet of cornmeal and rations with some supplements of small food, game. The homes have become mostly permanent, and most kept small gardens and herds. And I want to give you one example of how a seemingly simple shift in the mode of production can initiate waves of anxiety. This is, I believe, a picture of Bo that came out of one of the older publications. Bo, a leader of his group, herded goats and planted fields of maize and cottons. When the corn grew to maturity, kinsmen appeared to share in his good fortune, much like they did when hunters returned from the bush. He fed them a meal, offered his fire for them to stay overnight, knowing an extended stay would wipe out his harvest. He sent them on their way the next morning with a handful of his homegrown tobacco. The response? He was called stingy and hard-hearted. He became feared and accused of witchcraft. His son's wife left her husband and other kin shunned Bo's camp. It left him a successful but isolated farmer. Before long, Bo had had enough. He sold all his cattle and other stock for cash, packed his things, and walked across the border to settle near another group. John Marshall, an anthropologist, remarked about the Kung that development programs have acted as if the Kung wanted the old way. Steps that they should take include, and what they did to help them was they established a conservancy to protect wildlife. They let tourists pay to see wildlife. They encouraged the Kung culture by getting the young people to learn it again. The irony is that all this is that wildlife populations were declining. They brought in the buffalo that are not indigenous. They put animal tags on the animals, and any Kung caught hunting them were sent to jail. So Marshall advocated listening to the Kung, who say, we want to keep our farms, our cattle, the things we own ourselves, but we are no longer working for ourselves. We are working for others. We would not be on this planet if we had not taught ourselves to help our own. When things get impossible in one location, the best thing to do is to settle in a new place where you can improve your situation. To me, this is a remarkable statement of resilience. And according to my reading, is the Kung continue to maintain these strong relationships with their kin. So how to achieve a viable future for them? Small farms are important. Here people will be together, independent, and in their home from which they can reach kin and partners in other communities. They can supply themselves with food, support others with their own efforts as they did in the past, but with a different set of plants, animals, and implements. They would be buffered from the fluctuations of tourism and trophy hunting, and they would regain the connection to the earth and the social relationships. And they would continue to take care of others and their family in the old way. So where I came out with this in my rereading is that these anthropologists have linked Murray Bowen's ideas and Julian Stewart's ideas of understanding that the viable connection to the earth is absolutely critical. Bowen was clear that disconnect would set the emotional stage. And Julian Stewart was clear of the importance of social relationships, that it is through them that they connect with the earth, and that's what counts. Both of these views, I believe, are essential for sustaining life on earth. Now I'm going to move on, and I'm going to watch my time. I'm going to talk about an agricultural people who live in the Andes Mountains of Peru. When we refer to globalization and international trade, it's not new. The 450-year period of European expansion has transformed the worldwide distribution of crops, increasing the potential variety of people's diets and vastly increasing food production. It has seen a vast accumulation of wealth in the colonial centers and developed countries. On one hand, the capitalist economic system, the primary motivator for this modern colonialism, has unleashed powerful production forces that have intensified world trade, increased production, improved communications, and scientific and technological developments, and for many, improved the diets and the standards of living. On the other hand, there have been harmful effects on the population, including indigenous foods are being replaced by commercial crops intended for export. The insertion of capitalist economies is altering the social backbone of agriculture and producers who have become wage workers. Land once used to produce foods for locals have been taken over for luxury crops. The local farmers tend to produce less for themselves, and the poorest have come to depend on purchased foods. The result is a deterioration in the calorie and protein content of diets of substantial numbers of third world people. Countries have attempted to address marginalization as it threatens the capitalist system itself. Some have instituted land reform policies to provide greater access to land. Another is the Green Revolution, a post-World War II movement that has attempted to end worldwide hunger. This initiative is based on the belief that traditional methods used by small farmers are primitive and inefficient, and subsequently they produce only small yields. The government agencies have produced mechanized equipment, fertilizers, herbicides that enable farmers to bypass letting land lay in fallow. Cash crops are now produced on a massive scale. The net effect is that many small-scale farmers do not have the resources to participate in cash cropping, and consequently the gap between the wealthier and poorer farmers has increased. At the time of Spanish conquest, the Incas had expanded their influence over a large territory in Peru. Life in the Andean mountains is challenging, their high altitudes creating microenvironments ranging from lush valleys, sparse mountainsides, and almost barren plains. So as early as 950 BC, native populations adapted to this diverse ecosystem and developed a terrace system of agriculture with a well-developed irrigation system. This form of agriculture is described as a vertical economy. The highest elevation forms natural pastures for livestock. In the next zone, known as the Punya, potatoes are grown. Below this, maize and quinoa are grown. And since colonization, wheat and barley have been added. In the lowest zones, the tropical plants such as cocoa, plantains, manioc, citrus fruits, sugarcane are grown. The Inca Empire was a hierarchical society composed of many ethnic groups. By extracting tributes in exchange for protection, the Inca controlled upwards of a third of South America with a population of 9 to 16 million. The inhabitants paid a third of their agricultural produce and labored to build Inca roads and buildings. In return, they received protection. The Spanish arrived in 1531 with a small force and a few horses. In less than a year, the Inca Empire, which was already weakened by civil war, fell, and within 40 years, both disease and slaughter killed 80% of the population. Some say 90% of the population. So when the Spanish arrived, the basic economic unit in Inca society was the Ayllu, a self-sustaining social and economic unit of related nuclear families. The Ayllu owned all lands, some was held in common, and some was given to each family unit to produce food on their own. So given the high altitude and mountainous terrain, family units held parcels in different ecological zones where families produced a wide variety of crops like maize, potatoes, quinoa at different altitudes. A tight reciprocal exchange system prevailed. Community reciprocity was the driving, organizing dynamic for agricultural production. Every able-bodied member of the Ayllu was obligated to work in family fields, and in return they received the support from the community for such tasks as house construction. This was a system of mutual obligation and reciprocity. The Ayllu members assisted with communal work. In addition, each family formed ego-centered work groups which were composed of relations, allies, and neighbors who individually helped to cultivate his plot. In return, he was obligated to offer them food and beer and to reciprocate with his labor with those who had helped him. As the main productive unit of Andean society, the Ayllu was the social unit through which nuclear families and their kin connected to the earth. The Spanish took the place of the Inca rulers. The government concentrated Ayllus into the poor land in local settlements, and they created haciendas from the best lands that had been abandoned during the massive die-off. The natives worked the land much as they had done for their former lords. The independence from Spain came in 1824. The power transferred to the elite Creole class who received large tracts of land. These haciendas were surrounded by Ayllus that functioned as they had before. And it was one of the most unequal land tenure systems in North America, from what I understand. In the mid-20th century, 2% of the country's landowners controlled 69% of the arable land. In the early 1970s, agrarian reforms attempted to address this inequity. Haciendas were dismantled to make way for cooperatives, such as this alpaca herding cooperative. They combined 3 haciendas and 25 households who received a small salary plus a farm where they could grow food to feed their family and raise private herds, and in exchange for their care of the cooperative herds. So in effect, these cooperatives became even larger than the former haciendas, controlling 60% of the land but employing only 25% of the population. This reform benefited this group. They could afford radios, bicycles, and other modern items. Their diets were diverse, including imported and processed foods. The Ayllus lost out in the reform. Members did not receive land in the redistribution. So prior to the reform, these families had social relationships with nearby hacienda owners who had allowed the Ayllu members to graze livestock on their land. They hired the Ayllu members, and they permitted them to sharecrop. After the reform, when the haciendas were dismantled, the cooperatives did not hire outsiders, did not allow sharecropping, and they did not allow Ayllu members to graze cattle on their end. So in the end, the Ayllu members had either the same or less land than before the reform. In this group, 22% were landless, and they were unable to provide for their families. So increasingly, they returned to wage labor. Tom Leatherman's study, I think, is an excellent demonstration of what happens with the introduction of modernized economies. Most Ayllu members have a hard go of it. They still use traditional tools. Towns often have a tractor members can rent, but they can't afford them, and the hillsides are not conducive to this equipment. On a trip my husband and I made to the area, you would see these town tractors sort of parked in the town, and you would see the farmers out in their fields. So if a family produced a commodity such as alpaca wood or quinoa, the cyclical demands of this husbandry can and does compete with seasonal cycles for their own food products. There is not enough land to produce sufficient food, and consequently everyone is engaged in either wage labor or some kind of mercantile activity, such as these men in town waiting in hopes of getting a job. Women back on the island wind up working 2 jobs. They have been left at home with their elders and their children. Each of these factors point to the importance of scheduling household and non-household labor in situations where there are conflicting mixes of wage and home production. Tensions inevitably arise over the disposition of labor. These households are likely to experience more difficulty adapting to the seasonal rounds of planting and harvest. Wage labor comes first, so this group will delay planting their own fields. These households become vulnerable to illness. If anyone is removed from the labor force, the entire household responds, and they are reluctant or can't afford to hire workers to assist. So they cope by healthy members increasing work. Often it is the mother left at home trying to cope. If she gets sick, options dwindle even further. So they tend to drop commercial tasks in favor of subsistence-related tasks, a move that reduces cash income for them. Families with strong cooperative networks or close kin ties are able to mobilize the reciprocal exchanges. But in cases of chronic illness, poorer households entrench themselves, plant few crops with available labor, and they plant 50% fewer fields, and the yields are reduced by 25%. So this translates to lower levels of consumption, and over time results in the steady depletion of resources and the inability to rebuild stores of food, and according to Tom Leatherman, they become irreversibly marginal. And the small-scale farmer with the least access to resources is the most vulnerable in this global economy. So the Peruvian case is only too familiar. And the story of this group could be told in every country with an emergent economy. So how to solve this? Tom Leatherman says the first step is to understand the local social organizations that have developed over centuries of adjustment to changing environmental, political, and economic exploitations. Marshall's comments on the Kung way of life should be heard here. Let the Andean peoples speak for themselves to define a path. And the principles laid out by Murray Bowen and the human ecologist should be taken into consideration. That is, policies should produce programs that will keep or restore the direct connection to the land and social relationships that sustain these people for many hundreds of years. I'm looking at my time, and I have really flown through my talk, so we're going to have plenty of time to discuss, or I will spend more time on my research that I have not given full credit for today. So, on to Suffield. My research in 18th century Suffield, Connecticut shows that we are no different from our fellow humans. This study is what I call an historic ethnography. I do not have live informants to observe. I have only a number of documentary sources, account books, tax and land records, church records, and more. So understanding my data requires a theoretical approach that informs me. It also requires a more substantive knowledge of how societies are organized to procure a subsistence. My answer has been to reach widely in ethnographies and anthropological works to learn how societies respond to change, their social and economic structures, and how they are manifested in human behavior. So the analysis I'm going to talk about is based on documentary sources and ethnographies from South America, Ireland, and North America, all of which have provided a framework for me to understand the economic and social structure grounding social relationships. Readings also revealed how these relationships changed as new markets gave farmers new opportunities. And I'm going to, because I have time I see, I am going to describe some of the routes that I took about how theory in your head defines how you understand. And the guide that Murray Bowen taught me is that one does not ask why. One is a scientist. One focuses on the who, where, what. The why comes afterwards. And so this has been my effort. When I first started this work, I had read Conrad Ahrensberg, which I ask you all to read. It's very dated, but it gave you a sense of a community as a tight unit, a system in itself. And in it is sort of a sense that this reciprocating is mutual, and that it was mostly an egalitarian society. This view had been passed over into New England and the idea of what early New England was all about. And so I went with that in my head. I started studying my data. It didn't fit. And so I went back, and I would, not having read a lot in my anthropology program about economic anthropology and how to understand what I was looking at, I would make jokes about going on shopping trips in the Brown University Library, picking books on social network. It was Julian Stewart that gave me the clue. I kept walking back because Julian Stewart, we did not study him, so I had to walk back and remember what Murray Bowen told me. I had to go back into the economic anthropology. The economic anthropology sees the beginning of economy in one school as the exchange. I make something, I give it to you, either sell it in kind or as a gift. That is where the exchange and the economy and the social organizations begins. Then there is another group of economic anthropologists whose thought comes out of a lot of the Marxian economics. And aside from all the judgments that are present in there, I had to read it. And I finally found a book by Stephen Goodman on the rise of the capitalist economy from a country in South America. And there he made the point that there is a different way to think about economy. And that is, it begins with the human laboring, connecting with the earth. It is labor. There is no family that can do it on their own. And it is that point that the social organizations mobilize to sustain the community as a whole. I am sure that any of the that this is consistent with biological thought. So that was my inspiration. And as I started to go back into the data, I began to realize that there wasn't one egalitarian, happy society reinforcing each other in ways that made them feel good. And I use that in the Murray Bowen sense. Anyway, so that is the inspiration. And this project took me, 10 years. My dissertation committee was going nuts. But, when are you going to do this? But it gave me time to read the documents. It gave me time to look at the tax records, what they would say, what they wouldn't say. I would go to the church records and learn what they would say. I would go to the account books. And as I began to understand them, I was able to read them and create a very different social and economic system that began to make sense. And by golly, I picked a time that showed the transformation from a subsistence farming into commercialized farming. So I was able to capture in the 18th century a process that was very similar to what's happening in the third world communities today. And it is on the basis of this that I began to read more and more about third world economies and thinking there is a deep way to think about it. So that's what I did for my dissertation. And I will also tell you a story that I had just finished some of the work where I had a map of all the social networks of all the families. And my dad was really quite ill at that time, and I brought it up to him, and his brilliant blue eyes just shot open. And then some of you may have been in the house with him at that time, because he took the map and held it up and said, "Look." Well, I think had he lived longer, he would have he would have begun to appreciate and incorporate the idea of looking at social formations. So, and we can talk about this more as we go along. So, back to Suffield, Connecticut. As colonists arrived from Europe and began settlements in the New World, their colonies underwent transformation that are not unsimilar to what happened in Peru. In 1620, a group of Puritans landed at Plymouth. They set up a trading post. They established a fishing settlement. They began to plant crops and to raise livestock. Unlike the Virginia colony, where commercial operations dominated agriculture from the beginning, New England farmers generally supported their families with subsistence farming to produce multiple crops and animals for consumption, not sale. There were a few exceptions. In Rhode Island, some farmers produced hundreds and even thousands of sheep, cattle, and horses. And in the Connecticut River Valley, a few farmers began to develop extremely productive trading fur, and they began raising livestock for the export market. And because the land in Suffield was poor in comparison to other areas of the valley, Suffield did not interest the early commercial developers, and it remained a wilderness until 1671, when settlers established a community of primarily small farmers. So for 100 years, farming remained predominantly subsistence-oriented, and their social relationships were focused around their kin and their neighbors, until the cities had grown and the West Indies market exploded. At this time, farmers began to grow flax and to raise beef cattle. The 18th century account books kept by these farmers were the main source of my information. They captured a huge variety of economic activities of the farmer himself that I account and the people that they interacted with. It included the crops and animals they raised, as well as many forms of agricultural labor. They recorded the interactions with their nuclear family, their extended kin, their friends, their business associates. In all, I found over 200 account books after doing a survey of all the towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And out of these, I identified 2 extended families, each of which spanned 5 generations. And out of these, I selected the accounts of 12 individuals, all dating from 1765 to 1810. This was still a monumental task that took months, even years. Fortunately, there was a woman, Delphina Hamma Clark, was the first female graduate from the Yale School of Architecture, who had married a local man. And she kept herself intellectually engaged by reconstructing the land history of the entire town. Oh my gosh. For 30 years, she pored over records. She told me privately the town clerk let her take them home, so she worked into the wee hours of the morning. She reconstructed who lived where, who built what house, and as she did so, she left many genealogies and maps. With this source, combined with others, I was able to reconstruct who was related to whom and where they lived. And as I worked, it became apparent that I needed to do more than family history. I had to reconstruct the roads, because the roads had changed. So I mined her records again and consulted others to reconstruct the landscape. Here is the map, and showing the old roads and the social networks. Now, I know it's really tiny, but and it doesn't seem to be in focus, but the Sykes family lived near the river on the east side of town. And, whoops, let me go back. The river's on the east side, and then there's the main road coming down through the center. That was all the Sykes family. And the Sheldon family lived inland. What I noticed is how tight the 2 networks were. It would have been possible to walk or ride a horse anywhere, but no one did. No one walked or rode far to engage in farm activities. So I guess that's as good as it can do. Okay, the next step was to reconstruct the economic structure of this community. So I used an analysis of a 1780 tax record that showed who owned the land, the houses, the livestock. And this was critical because I had to reconstruct who could support themselves or not. Actually, I did it, and that helped me understand how little I understood. I discovered who could and could not produce food to feed their families. And I discovered 4 distinct demographic groups, and the poorest group made up 35% of the household. Most of these people did not own a house, any land, and most everyone owned a horse, a cow, or a pig. But it's clear over a third of the families did not have the resources to provide a basic subsistence to their families. The wealthiest families were really small in number, only 5% of the population. And everyone owned at least one house, and they controlled most of the good land. Their livestock holdings were substantial, meaning they had sufficient resources that they could provide for themselves and help others in town. So the accounts show that until the 1780s, even the wealthiest of these farmers practiced subsistent agriculture. With their kin and friends, they maintained reciprocal relationships, occasionally exchanging a quarter of beef or veal or the help of a son. And since what they needed most, remember what the economic anthropologists were saying about what a farmer needs most is labor. They often exchanged labor, lending a son or helping others to plow or mow, or getting some of their other kin to come in and to help them. So there was an exchange here. And what I discovered is that in this stratified society, it was not everybody producing for themselves and exchanging to reinforce their cultural values. It was more about the economy, how you make a living and how you get along. The wealthy farmers helped out their less fortunate kin by providing pasture, the use of their oxen, and food, what the poorer kin needed. And in return, the kin provided labor, what the wealthier farmers needed. They came in and slaughtered livestock. They made hats. They made barrels. They did carpentry work. They repaired farm equipment. After the Revolutionary War, Boston, New York City, and Hartford were all growing. And there were linseed oil manufacturers needing flax, and the plantations in the West Indies all needed beef to feed their slaves. So I want to quickly describe how the social relationships changed when the farmers shifted from subsistence farming to raising a commodity. And the first is the Sykes family, who lived along the river. Until Victory Sykes died in 1785, he ran a subsistence farm and a sawmill. He relied on his friends who lived nearby, and his use of hired labor was minimal. Of all the people in these account books that he interacted with, 50% were related to him. They were his cohorts. They were primarily cousins or brothers. But he brought in, one man was a nephew, Lot Sykes, and he was a man of modest means who just lived down the road and exchanged his labor. He was the primary slaughterer. And in exchange, he got food, molasses, the use of a pasture, the ox team, or a horse. By having so many account books that I could look at, I began to understand that Lot Sykes was a butcher, and that all the different farmers would bring him in. That I brought down the myth of the self-sufficient farmer who could do everything, that there was specialization within this society. The only way I was able to understand this was having all these multiple records to draw on. It took me years to be able to look at a record in an account book and say, this was kin, this was a hired laborer. And you could tell by the differences in the kind of food and what they were, and what the exchange was about. So his son, Victory Jr., took over the farm, and he didn't waste any time and began to raise flax. And guess what? To him, kinsmen were not part of his new economic scheme. Now, remember, his father had 50% of the people he interacted with were related. For Victory Jr., only 10% of the individuals were related. Instead, there were many entries of non-related individuals who he performed day labor. They came and labored, and he paid them with cash and food. So, from the Murray Bowen perspective, Victory Jr. cut himself off from his relatives. I know it economically. I'm wondering about the depth of it, things that are hard to read in the documentary records. The second is the Sheldon family. And Elijah Sheldon maintained a subsistence farm for many years, and during which time he provided for his family, and like Victory Sykes, at least 50% of the people he interacted with were kin. His son, Martin, inherited the farm in 1784, and just like Victory Jr., he didn't waste any time. He continued to raise food for his family, but he opted to begin raising beef cattle to sell. And he was also an entrepreneur. At age 38, he became one of the founders of a bank in Suffield. Later, he invested in another, plus 2 insurance companies. Given his economic ventures, one might presume he cut off economic relationships with his kin, not this man. 36% of the individuals were his kin, and it shows that his relationships with his brothers and cousins were strong. And what is interesting about this family group is that he joined in commercial ventures with them, and you could tell, and I could understand this only because I knew who owned what and how they were able to support themselves. And I was beginning to see that beef cattle somehow in this account book was different than the others, and I began to realize this man was producing the commodity. And so the exchanges in here took some interesting turns, is that they exchanged. His business activities included pasturing beef cattle, delivering beef cattle to market, and these people exchange also a full range of subsistence-related activities: labor, pasturage, occasionally food, the use of oxen, bulls, and horses. And he also hired large numbers of low-ranking individuals who were not related that labored for them. I was able to tell that he boarded with him for brief periods, or they rented a farm just nearby or a house nearby. And there were many who had no kin that I could identify. The record showed that many of these people were transient, that they stayed in town only long enough to be married, to have a child. Some stayed for long periods, renting homes and working for farmers like Martin Sheldon. Many of these families ended up in the Suffield poor rolls later in the 19th century. And so the account book data shows how different families respond to new opportunities. One dropped their family-based labor and relied almost solely on hired labor. Another engaged both his kin as well as hired labor in his new business ventures. So, after working with the account book data and everything else that I understood, I began to understand that there was really something important going on that impacted the well-being of the poor day laborers. And I began to understand that the dietary evidence that I had pulled from the account books was the best measure to impact the shift from family-based subsistence agriculture in this town to commercially based agriculture. And so I'm going to present something that I'm going to have to take a little bit of time. I began by, if you can take a look, and I know the writing is far too small, but PowerPoint wouldn't, in my knowledge of PowerPoint, couldn't do anymore. And so what I did is I pulled out every single meat and dairy product related entry out of all of these account books, and I recorded them by season as the time at which they were exchanged. And I came up with really what is really quite fascinating. I added them all up. And you know we have 4 seasons? Well, their anthropologists have come up with something that they call economic seasons. When you look at the agricultural cycle and you begin to see the exchange of food, you begin to see 3 economic seasons. And one in October to February, which we would think of as the winter. That was the time when people harvested. That is the time when they began to slaughter animals, because it had to be cold for the meat to cool down. And more importantly, the pastures could no longer support the livestock, so it was the time to call the herds. Then moving into spring, it's when there was planting. And back in the winter was also the time that they began to salt their meat to create a store throughout the entire year. And the spring was a time when they were planting things and the animals were beginning to give birth. The summertime is a time when there were calves that had been born. It was a time of dairying. It was a time of a lot of growth. And so what I discovered is that they had some type of fresh meat in every single season, except for maybe the spring, when there wasn't a lot of fresh meat to be had. In the winter, there was beef, and you could see it mount, and as soon as it cooled off, it just almost came to a complete end. And it was also the season when they would slaughter the pork, so there was a glut of pork. There were small amounts of the preserved food, the butter, the cheese. And come springtime, they could no longer slaughter the animals without the meat going bad before the social group could consume it. And so they sort of moved into a period of what is often called in anthropology a season of scarcity. And then you saw where there are lots of butter and cheese and pork. So then come summertime, there is a period of growth. There's lots of veal. The calves are born in the spring, and in the summer they were slaughtered off to provide fresh food. The lambs were slaughtered at this time. Towards the end of the season, the muttons were slaughtered. And that provided a fresh food. But there was also the preserved salted beef and salted pork. And so once I had gotten a general lay of what the diet was like throughout town, then I could take a step back and look at what happened to the different demographic groups. And what I began to understand is that the wealthier farmers and their kin received the fresh meats year-round when they were available. And so even the poorer kin who exchanged labor with their wealthier kin had the same diet. And so that but then you go back to the people who were the hired labor, who were not related. And that's when you began to see the impact of the shift in the economy on the welfare of the households themselves. It was this group who couldn't produce food on their own, and they literally worked for their supper. And the farmers gave them the salted foods. And they would come in and they would get half a pound of pork, or a pound of cheese, or a pound of butter. That's what they were eating. And I know that because when you went back to the other record, you knew they weren't raising animals on their own. And so, so the message for this is that a change in social relationships from a tight-knit family-based labor where foods are free-flowing, they're flowing down to kin who could not support themselves, to hired labor that were not related and paid in kind for more of the preserved foods, small amounts, is sort of a proxy of what the impact in this community was. And I wondered how that relates to some of these modern third world economies. And so looking at the change in food may be one of a really good proxy that you can get at, and you can push it back hundreds of years. And so once I had been able to sift through and synthesize and integrate all these different sources of data, I was going back and reading the history for New England as well. And I began to learn that in former times, New Englanders maintained long-term, lifelong memberships to the town they were born in, meaning that any time during their life they could return and expect support. And this was in the 17th century. By the 18th century, the towns were no longer wanting to support this, and so they cut that off. And so there released a large number of people moving around. In New England, they were called the strolling poor. And these are the people I were capturing as the laborers. They would move from one town to the next and the next. Very ephemeral, hard to reconstruct. They had fewer children. Sometimes I could capture that they had one child born in the town, but their families were much smaller than the ones that had land and could control and support themselves. And so I was able to conclude that in the late 18th century there were increasing numbers of individuals who were no longer protected by the largesse of their kin. Because remembering at this time there were people like Victory Sykes who were hiring labor rather than using their kin. And there is an exchange labor in the sense, if you may know about the barn raisings and the quilting bees and all of this, exchange labor is considered to be fairly inefficient because you have to feed them, and often it includes beer or something. And when you move into commercial agriculture, the move is to hire labor. You know, we hire you for a job and you perform your job. You don't have to do all of these extended socializing kinds of things. And so what I began to understand after all this work is that these families were like those that Tom Leatherman identified from Peru. That these showed signs of their situation. They had no kin to turn to, and their relationships with nearby farmers lacked the depth, the family connection to others who had known each other since childhood. And it was only their skill and their ability as hire hands that gave their families a basic subsistence. And so the implications of this on the diet and health of this group are staggering. And I would like to see somebody go back into the documentary records and start looking for other markers to try to track this. I found it amazing that what we're seeing today happened in our own country as we were developing. So kind of looking forward, it seems inevitable that the whole world will someday be under the huge umbrella of our global economy. And Elizabeth Marshall Thomas pointed out that nostalgia is not a solution. And neither does governments trying to preserve past ways that reflect the desires or what they think are the desires of the indigenous peoples. It's time to listen to the indigenous people and to let them define a development program, one that will somehow retain their connection and their ownership of what they produce, rather than being producing products for others and they get cash in exchange. I think that is a key element. And it's something that Murray Bowen understood, because they lived off everything they produced. And I heard many, many stories that the only thing they bought were crackers, coffee, sugar, and spices. I heard that all my life. I heard that what his family really wanted was store-bought bread, and they would fight over when they got it. So it's not useful to impose our sense of what should be on the other. And so I would say that Murray Bowen's societal process concept identifies the emotional strength of a direct connection. And he understood it, and I think if this view could be combined with lessons from human ecology, that social relationships do count, that together they have the potential in developing programs that have a way to enable families to sustain themselves in the face of the global economy. And so that's pretty much where I am, and I still have a couple minutes. So Victoria, can I tell you what my dream is? What I would love to do? Okay. I've often wondered why Murray Bowen didn't talk about labor exchanges in his community. And I haven't quite got the full answer to it. And and his remaining sibling, the youngest daughter in the family, died a year ago. And I called her shortly before she died, and I said, my dad never talked about exchanging labor with kin. And she said, well, there weren't anyone around. They were gone. I went, oh my gosh, no wonder. So now I have a little genealogical project to do, to go back and use my historical skills. And Woodton, the Luff family, I knew about my father's father, of where they were, but they never talked about when and all the Luffs left, and why they left, and when they left, and what they did before. I don't know. I would try to pry it out of my family, what grocery stores were there? Well, they are who they are, and, they were my informants answering from what they knew. So to understand, and I also know that Murray Bowen was a child and a young adult who lived on his farm and left shortly, when he went to college, and he never, and then during the war, his family moved into town, so they stopped farming. So how is it, he observed what he saw, and so that is a fact. And so now I have an historical project of going back into the Waverly, Tennessee court records. And, and this takes several levels, like they all left, almost all at once. And if you look at the transmission of property and businesses from one generation to another, I would anticipate that a lot of this happened at the death of his grandfather, and that his, the siblings and cousins and all started leaving at that time. So I also need to, there's another thing I haven't really talked about in anthropology, that they talk about the patron-client relationship. His father inherited the family business, and he worked with my father's half-uncle, and the two of them ran the business. And Jess Bowen, who we always called Papa Jess, was this wonderful man, this strong man, and my dad always said he knew everybody in town, and if he didn't know them, he knew what family they belonged to by the way they walked. And they maintained records in a way that a lot of people maintained ongoing economic relationships with them. They kept debts for a long period of time. He knew the family. He knew who was good for it and who wasn't. He was a man that they would go to when they needed help or needed a hand or needed an ear. That was our Papa Jazz. And, so here is this economic system in a rural community in Tennessee that I don't fully understand. And one of my goals for today was to have done the research so that I could talk about it. But life has been too busy, so I look forward to sort of piecing together this exchange system in these rural communities where there, so you'll have to stay tuned on it. But, you can see that the family sold the land to Walmart down the road. Or actually, no, it was a lease. And you know what happened to the business? They went out of, they closed down the business. But as they were doing so, and as they were still attempting to operate, people would go down to Walmart and buy an iron and take it to Bowen and have them fix it. And they would have to respond that, we're really so sorry, take it back to Walmart. And because they charged a little more, but you got a lot of the services. And so this is part of what's happening today. Move this up into my generation, where his sister was the last living sibling, and my cousin took over the funeral home and the store, and they were going to shop at Walmart, and there was my aunt going, there's a grocery store downtown. They support you. You support them. So that was the old way that she was speaking about. So let me stop there. And